a major exhibit of African art. It debuted at the Smithsonian in Washington this summer, opened in Fort Worth, Texas in November, and will tour America and Europe for the next 2 years, before returning home to Belgium's Tervuren Museum outside Brussels. Founded by King Leopold II 100 years ago, the Tervuren boasts the world's greatest collection of Central African art, 250,000 objects, including some key works of African art history. It's been a mecca to scholars, like the Dallas Museum of Art's Ramona Austin.
When I was a pre-doctoral fellow at Tervuren, the Royal Museum for Central Africa, I used to pass by this object every day and it just knocked me out, you know. It was in such contrast to this big colonial building. And what got me was the gesture of the object, because you usually think of African art as static, you know, just facing you frontally, but this guy was twisted around and he had this incredible back and you could feel the notches of his spine and that tongue that's sticking out.
Now, for African art as we know it, this is pretty naturalistic, as are these two Yombe masks, worn by priests to connect with the spirits of the dead, whose color is white. In Yombe culture, masks were called ngobudi, from the word that means a sinking feeling in the pit of the stomach. There's a huge range to Central African art styles. No surprise, since the so-called Congo region, from which most of this comes, is home to more than 250 different cultures. But the African art that so affected the West is more abstract, simple and dramatic, startling and exaggerated. Above all, this African art packed an emotional wallop. In generalizing forms and emotions, its impact became more immediate, especially on the early masters of European modernism at the turn of the century, artists like Picasso.
What it did for the modernists was to allow them to get away from realistic representation, was to give them a visual vocabulary to use. It gave an idea about how to give a psychological truth to the human form, or to any other figures, or to a scene that they wish to depict.
Even today's cliches of modern art, remember, were breakthroughs 100 years ago.
Edvard Munch, the scream. The face is very plain. It's been very simplified. There's a wonderful Luba vase that you have with the mouth open and up, and it's like it's yelling. So it allows us to tell a great deal economically by taking the figure away from the realm of reality.
Austin points to this Suku statue of a clan mother as a case in point, a reminder of its culture's origins, with distortions that inspired modern artists and still have the power to impress. This is the woman.
She's the essence of womanhood. She is fertile, and she has made us.
So when someone says, gee, they couldn't, do naturalistic images of people, they were very primitive, you say, no, these are abstract ideas that call for abstract means to get them across.
Exactly. The form that it takes really is a system of signs in the way that things are put together that can be read by the people in their society.
The artists of Central Africa glorified the motherness of their mothers, the chiefness of their chiefs, the blade here symbolizing the power of the chief's word. And the artists gave a grandeur to even the most workaday objects, from hair combs to a wooden cup to a part of a bed, this from a house of seclusion in which young girls were prepared for marriage. But many of these art objects were magical, more literally than Western art almost ever is. These figures are what noted anthropologist Wyatt McGaffey has called forces from the land of the dead, with actual containers for magical potions to augment their potency. Often, they're totems of revenge, nails driven into them to stick it to an enemy. The most common magical art objects of all were masks.
This is a mask that has two sides. It has a white side. It's the side that is of a healthy person. The black side is a side of illness. We can see the small spots where this was the victim of smallpox. We can see the nose twists. We can see that the face falls and the mouth twists. This is a person who's been paralyzed. The side of the face is black because in this person's awkward paralytic movements, the person has fallen into the fire and blackened this side of the face.
Now, masks like this were designed to scare you. In this case, so you'd treat handicapped people well because, hey, it could happen to you. And this mask served to frighten young candidates for manhood into respecting their elders. Unfortunately, much of the magic is lost today, at least on a Westerner like me.
I feel bad sometimes when I look at an object like this that I'm not scared of it the way it was meant to make people feel when they looked at it.
That's okay.
You're not scared by it.
No.
Were you ever scared by it?
No. Because I find it wonderful to get into these swelling forms, and I want to understand it visually, and then I go after it intellectually. So how can you're not frightened by it because you get over that first fear of the unknown, because there's something else far more exciting.
Now, as you look at this mask from the boa culture, I should warn you, our story is about to take a very sharp turn. Masks like this one were meant to intimidate enemies in battle. The boa stopped making them when it became clear the magic didn't work. Didn't work against whom, you might ask? Against us Westerners.
From about 1880 on, it became very clear that masks were not a good protection against machine gun bullets.
Journalist and author Adam Hochschild has spent the last 3 years researching a book about Central Africa and its colonization by Belgium's King Leopold II. He's surprised there's no mention of this history in the exhibit.
It's a little bit as if we were in an art exhibit that the government of Germany had sent around the world of great pieces of Jewish art and sculpture. But that within this exhibit there was nothing said about the Holocaust. The Congo was the scene of the bloodiest part of the European conquest of Africa. During about a 40-year period, the population of that territory was cut in half. It dropped by 10 million people.
Now, the Belgian massacre wasn't the deliberate extermination of a people so much as the result of, in essence, slave labor over an area 1/4 the size of the United States. King Leopold II conquered and bought off local chiefs, then played the major European powers against one another so he could make the Congo Free State his own personal, very profitable colony. Wrote a Belgian senator and reformer in 1898, referring to the area from which these objects came.
Unceasingly we meet these porters, black, 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 miserable, frizzy, and bare heads supporting the load. They come and go like this by the thousands, dying along the road or, the journey over, heading off to die from overwork in their villages.
At first they hauled ivory, being used by African artists at the time to make icons like this Yambe clan mother, whose open mouth, it so happens, spoke to the departed dead. Then, when bicycle tires were invented, rubber was discovered growing wild in Central Africa. A man of vast appetites, Leopold wanted to get the rubber out fast. His private army of 19,000 under white officers would go into villages, buying slaves from local chiefs, or often simply taking women and children hostage to force the men into the forest.
The hostages were treated terribly. The women were frequently raped. They were given nothing to eat. The men would have to go into the forest sometimes for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time in order to get enough rubber to, meet their quotas. The whole thing was administered by the whip and the gun. And then when you have a traumatized, malnourished population like that, as we know from the concentration camps, disease takes a terrible toll.
The most chilling images of the atrocities became standard reformist propaganda at the turn of the century. Severed right hands. Bullets, it seems, were expensive in the 1800s to be used only to kill mutinous workers. To prove this, soldiers had to bring back a right hand for every bullet fired. Apparently, sometimes they'd miss, shoot an animal, even hoard the bullets for a mutiny of their own. So they'd chop off and deliver the right hand of a living native.
So there were lots of people in the Congo at that time who had no right hand just so that somebody could prove that they hadn't wasted a bullet?
Yes, and there are photographs of them that British missionaries took. And this was something that really shocked the world at that time.
While they were doing all this, the Belgians were also bringing back objects. To them, curiosities of a primitive people. Leopold set up the museum in Tervuren in 1897 as part of a World's Fair, which also featured live Africans on display.
They set them up living in two, quotes, uncivilized villages and one, quote, civilized village on the fairgrounds. More than 1 million people came to look at these folks. Several of them died during the time that they were there, but they were basically put on exhibit as if they were animals at a zoo.
Exotic curiosities. For many, that's what Africans were in the West just 100 years ago, as was their art. And yet, the images began to take hold, to suggest new ways of looking at the world, to enrich Western culture, though not in the way King Leopold imagined. The West won all the battles, Ramona Austin says, but in their art, the cultures of Central Africa have managed to outlive, even transcend, the horrors they endured.
If we see Africa or other places in the world as falling to Western dominance because the Gatling gun was an invention of such destruction and allowed the Europeans to dominate in a technical way, we misunderstand what culture is all about. And it's all about the nature of existence.
And to Austin, the nature of existence is what this art, what all art maybe, explores, for those who are willing to take the time to explore it.